you're watching a special edition of Talking Europe on France 24. I'm Catherine Nicholson, today in Brussels at the European Commission, where we could soon know who will replace Jean-Claude Juncker as this institution's president. My guest today is a politician who is being tipped by France's President Macron, among many others, to get that job. Margrethe Vestager was until 2014 the Deputy Prime Minister of Denmark. Since then, she's become known as the European Union's giant slayer, while serving as its competition commissioner. She slapped fines of more than €8 billion on Google, forced Apple to pay billions in unpaid taxes, and more. Margrethe Vestager, thank you very much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Well, let's talk first about the Commission presidency. We're all waiting to find out, of course. There has never yet been a female president of this institution. Do you think you're going to be the first?
Well, that I don't know, but I find that it's long overdue that you have a woman on this post as well, because women are not a minority. We are half the European population, half the world population. So I think it's about time that also the Commission reflects that fact. Because it is important that you have more diverse forums to exercise power.
On the political side of the balances, you're from the Liberal political family. Now, that group came third in the recent EU Parliament elections. The European Commission's Vice President Günther Oettinger, one of your current colleagues, is from the biggest group, the EPP. He said it's out of the question to give you the job of president. What's your reaction to that?
Well, that's obviously his opinion. The European elections were outstanding because so many Europeans, they took the decision, I want to be part of our democracy. More than 50% voted, and that's a first. And second, they didn't vote as they usually voted. The EPP were losing, I think, around 40 seats. The S&D were losing seats as well. My social liberal family gained seats, so did the Greens. So there's a new dynamic in the European Parliament. And I think it's very important to hear that call for change.
Well, given those numbers and the Liberals, as you say, making gains but still placing as the third biggest group, is it legitimate to have a Liberal political president of the Commission?
Well, you need to find a coalition that will back the Commission president. Because the important thing is what coalition will actually work for Europeans in the 5-year term to come, and how to make that happen. Because why would you say that it's legitimate that the biggest minority would hold the presidency of the Commission? It must be a balance between gender, competence and politics, and geography for that matter, to make that happen.
OK, well, we'll come on to some of those issues in a bit more detail a bit later on. Right now, though, I'd like to talk about your current day job as competition commissioner. I mentioned that you have fined digital giants, you've blocked mergers, including quite recently German steelmaker ThyssenKrupp and Tata Steel. Donald Trump called you the EU's tax lady, and he said, I quote, "She really hates the United States." What do you make of that comment? Is it true?
Well, I've done my own fact-checking on that sentence, and it is true I work with tax. It is definitely true that I'm a woman. But the rest of this sentence is then, well, completely wrong. And if you look at the way we work, you'd find that there is no bias. You'd find that in a number of our cases where a US company is center of attention, it's because of US companies complaining about the same company. And Europe is a great place to do business. And of course, if you play by the rule book.
So it's not about attacking American companies to try and improve European position in the market?
No, not at all. Because one of the main reasons why also US companies are successful in Europe is, of course, that customers like their products. Business-to-business customer, the final consumer likes their products. That is why you're successful. And in that, of course, everyone is challenged to be part of that competition. But it is, of course, important that there is an openness for competitors. Because what we have seen in recent years is especially that when everything goes digital, it can be increasingly difficult to be a startup, to be a scale-up, to be able to make it actually to find potential customers and show them your innovation.
Now, in the case of the ThyssenKrupp-Tata Steel merger, ThyssenKrupp, a German company, it's lost vast amounts of its value since it became apparent that the merger was going to be blocked. So is that perhaps counterproductive, that blocking a merger on these competition grounds actually hurts a major European company, which, of course, employs thousands of Europeans?
Well, actually, I think their shares went up on the day we announced that the merger were to be prohibited. This was a merger where we had two issues. One about the kind of steel you use to produce cars, and one about the kind of steel you use to do packaging, for instance, canned tomatoes or other canned vegetables. And here, of course, you find that it's in the business-to-business relationship. We have very important European industries producing cars, very important industries producing food packaging. And in order to be competitive, you need, of course, affordable prices, competitive prices, innovation, where you buy your input. And here there was a risk that prices would go up.
ThyssenKrupp and Tata, however, they argued that one of the reasons for promoting this merger was to try and be able to counter the giant steel industry in China, which we know is producing very, very cheap steel and sort of dumping it on the world market. Perhaps, again, there, an angle where we could see this as a counterproductive bloc.
Yeah, but here we're dealing with sort of the dumping of steel with our trade defence mechanisms. This is my colleague Cecilia Malmström. She's very efficient in making sure that things are not coming here for the wrong reasons. What we see in Europe is very high quality, very advanced, also technologically advanced, and produced in ways that are not as climate problematic as in many other places of the world. And this is, of course, why we still need competition as a driver here in Europe.
Well, looking at the European Union's other big global relationship with the United States, mentioned Donald Trump before, relations with Europe's oldest ally have become much more difficult in the last couple of years. The US pulled out of the climate accord, the Iran nuclear deal. There are trade issues as well. Donald Trump vastly increasing tariffs on steel, aluminium, other things. On this trade point, do you foresee that a trade war could now be on the cards?
Well, I would hope not, because it serves no one. Trade is good, trade wars, they're bad. And you see what we're trying to do. Again, my colleague Cecilia, she's very likely to be successful in finalising trade agreement with Vietnam, as we have done with Singapore, with Canada, also advancing with Mercosur, showing that Europe is there for the global market.
But in terms of Donald Trump, it does seem that he's spoken about trade matters having helped with relations with Mexico, trying to put pressure on Mexico in terms of immigrants crossing the border, that sort of thing. Donald Trump certainly does seem to see this as a very effective tool for his own political popularity.
I think there are, as far as I've heard, there are more to that story than just the threat of imposing tariffs, depending on sort of the dynamics of that negotiation. And I think it's very important that we here in Europe have the sufficient confidence to say, well, this is what we do. Europe is the richest continent with the preferred trading partner for many, many, many more countries than the US. And that, of course, gives us a different approach to global trade, because we see the benefits, we see the millions and millions of jobs that comes from trade.
Well, I mentioned climate, the US pulling out of the climate accords. We've, of course, here in Europe had enormous climate rallies, marches, much of it sparked by the Swedish teenage climate activist Greta Thunberg. Now, she says that she wants us to panic and act as if our house was on fire. Are you panicking?
Well, I have never experienced a situation where panic was the best possible solution. And I think even when your house is on fire, you need immediately to plan how to make sure that everyone is rescued. And that takes a cool heart and a safe pair of hands. But she's completely right that a number of things will have to be done. And I think also that, to some degree, fighting climate change is a driver that we need to wake up the dynamism of Europe. Also because it's a given that we will have to do something about it. In my opinion, we should do it faster rather than slower. And that dynamic that comes from fighting climate change, I think maybe also could unleash the dynamics that we hold in our societies that has brought us to where we are now.
We started by talking about you potentially being the next president of the European Commission. What action would you take on climate change if you did get that job?
Well, actually, as we speak, we've just been through the national plans to take action on climate change so that we are on track for the promises made in the Paris Agreement. But I think it's important that we get to a situation where we break down the goals to shorter periods of time so that we make sure that we are on track.
Would you take a carrot and a stick approach as well? Would there be more sanctions for EU countries that weren't meeting their targets? Because as things stand, no EU country is on track to meet its climate targets.
Well, actually, with the work done by Margrethe Vestager and Miguel Canete, now the plans are on track to meet our obligations as we took them in the Paris Agreement, in order to be able to have the sufficient, force and influence when we meet the rest of the planet countries in this autumn. Because we need to be on track, because I think Europe is one of the prime promoters of living up to our responsibility. And that work, of course, has taken a lot of effort on my colleagues, just to show that this can actually happen.
All right, so we've just got time to talk about, something we spoke about right at the beginning, women in power, particularly here in Europe. What difference would it make to have a 50-50 split on the European Commission? Currently, there are 9 out of the 28 European Commissioners are women.
Well, first, the obvious, that Europeans could mirror themselves also in the Commission as such, because as said, women, we're not a minority. It's a 50-50 also among citizens. And the second thing is that when you're in a diverse group, when you sort of break uniformity in how we look, very often you also break uniformity in how you think. You get better discussions, you get better decisions. You see that very much in business, and you also see that in political decision-making, in my experience.
So if you became Commission President, would you have 14 women commissioners, 14 male commissioners?
Well, it may be 14 women and 13 men, since we may lose the UK. But I think this is one of the areas where we can show Europeans that we change. Because a lot of the changes that we're dealing with, they, of course, are slow, and it takes time to realise that things are changing.
But do you believe in quotas?
Well, call it a quota. I don't think 50-50 is a quota. And anyway, we have accepted sort of informal male quotas of 80-90% for not even decades, but for centuries, where women have not had the same access to exercising power. I think it is about time that we get a gender-balanced commission.
And in pursuing gender equality then, of course, there are different ways to go about it. Sort of positive discrimination often comes up. Do you think you can avoid accusations of tokenism, putting women into big jobs just to have a woman there?
Well, I think the problem why one has this idea about a token or not qualified is that very often we look for women to be men, because we're used to a man being in a leadership in a powerful position. Whenever you start changing your perspective to say, well, I want to have gender balance, then you also change your perspective, because one of the things with women is that we are very bad men.
Just time, I think, for a quick word about Brexit, that very dominant subject of recent months. But it has perhaps gone off the radar a little bit recently. The UK is busy, of course, with the Conservative Party's leadership election to replace Theresa May. Do you believe that the United Kingdom will leave the EU on October the 31st, which is the current deadline?
Well, it is for the UK to figure out how to leave the European Union, because it's their decision. And I think you're right to say that it has, to some degree, left the political agenda here. We've been busy talking about climate change, economy, jobs for young people, how to make sure that we get managed migration, a lot of things on substance with the European election. And that, I think, has been very healthy.
Currently, the front-runner to replace Theresa May is Boris Johnson, the former foreign minister. He says that he can get a better Brexit deal for the UK out of the EU. Do you believe that that's possible?
Well, our president has said it very clear that this is the deal. It's a good deal, and it's the only possible deal, because it's in a very straightforward way deals with people, peace, and, of course, monetary issues.
All right, Margrethe Vestager, that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you as well for watching. See you soon for more European news on France 24.